Thank you, Teresa. Hello. Trying to pressurize more people to come in. Good morning and welcome to this talk. Thank you so much for choosing to come to this conversation about South Africa. And first up, thank you to Teresa for putting in a lot of work to get me to come and visit this fascinating country of yours. I almost didn't arrive, she's right, but she's absolutely amazing. We had to change my flight to the last minute, and until she physically saw me here in Bergen, we weren't sure whether I was actually going to be part of this festival. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I hope we're going to have fun for the next 30 minutes. Out of interest, how many of you have actually been to South Africa before? Oh, wow, okay. I expected 4 hands, most of them South Africans who were actually in the room. So that's a pleasant surprise. It gives me some sense of what to talk to you about. So that's more than I'd expected. So that's very generous and very interesting. So my name's Eusebius. I'm a South African broadcaster and writer, generally a hustler. I go by different titles depending on what I had for breakfast. But my main job in South Africa is as a political analyst. And around that, I do a bunch of other things. I lecture in philosophy, I write, I'm on radio and TV when I'm not resigning from TV or radio shows. So currently I'm just writing and working on my 3rd book. So those are the different hats that I wear in South Africa. I studied law and philosophy in South Africa and then spent, I think, 4 winters of discontent at Oxford University, where I attempted unsuccessfully to do a PhD in philosophy before realizing that I'm going to slip into a coma or lose my personality if I don't go back to South Africa. So I've been back in South Africa for about 4 or 5 years, and currently I work mostly in the media, and I'm a part-time lecturer in philosophy at Wits University. So that's more or less who I am. What I wanted to talk about really is firstly what my impressions are, because it's my first time in Norway, of this country, walking around, coming in, being at the airport. And then I want to talk from there what my experiences broadly are in South Africa around a couple of the themes that you would have seen in the booklet about this talk. Anyone who's been to South Africa and anyone who is South Africa know there are certain themes you can't get away from in giving a story of what it is like living in South Africa currently. And I want to make some comments about South Africa, where South Africa is at when it comes to race, class, sex, shame, identity, 20 years into democracy. That's broadly what I want to talk about. But I want to talk to you about those things through some stories and some impressions, and then I'm going to leave about 10 minutes, 12 minutes for questions. Teresa must just make sure I don't talk too much. I can talk for hours on end. So I'll speak for about 15 minutes, and then we can have a conversation. But while I'm speaking, if you have a burning question that you will forget, please feel free to interrupt me, and let's have a conversation about these issues. So it was quite interesting arriving yesterday at the airport. I've been to more than 20 countries around the world, and only twice have I landed at an airport and be totally taken aback just aesthetically by what I see at the airport. The last time, several years ago, was when I went to Qatar to teach debating, or to spread democracy, but we called it teaching debating. And when I arrived at the airport, the first thing I noticed is how many men there were. And the only time I'd been in a room with so many men only in one space is when I've been to a gay bar. Not at an airport where most people are probably heterosexual, maybe even conservative in Qatar. And it was very strange. It was mostly Indian men at the airport. And I found out I'm a very bad historian. I'm also a bad tourist, as I told my fellow tourists this morning. But I quickly discovered that Qatar has got one of the highest proportions of men to women in the world, and mostly because of cheap male labor from India that gets transported over there. But visually, it was just weird to arrive at an airport, and I don't know, at least 60% of the people that I saw around me were all male. So that really struck me. Thought to myself, wow, this is the biggest gay club I've been to. And I thought I've seen it all in London and New York and Cape Town and Joburg, and I hadn't. The second time I had such an experience was yesterday, and it was just strange. It doesn't matter how well-traveled you are, how cosmopolitan you think you are, when you arrive at an airport and you're the only black person as far as the eye can see, it is absolutely resting as a South African, as a black South African. So that was my first impression of landing at Bergen yesterday, was being confronted by a sea of whiteness around me. And you look around, you start thinking, oh, there's a black person, and you connect eyes, and you hope the person will connect eyes with you as well. And then you can strike up a conversation in racial solidarity. And I looked at this person who was on the other side of trying to sell me pizza slices. And when he did speak, he spoke your funny language, and there was no chance of communicating. And I realized that he was one of the locals. He just happens like he has been snatched from Somalia and been transplanted to Norway. And I tell that story first up because it's very difficult. Doesn't matter whether you've traveled, whether you've been educated, whether you've left Grahamstown, like my two homegirls who are in the room. There are certain ways of being South Africa that are still the same in 2014 as they were in 1994, and certainly for me as a young South African who's 35 years old, who grew up just as apartheid was ending. And one of them, undeniably, and I'm sure in the second session, on this two-part session on South Africa, it will be interesting to be in dialogue with Johnny Steinbeck about it as well, is your awareness of your racial identity. That is actually my first impression in the first 24 hours of being in the city, is being a minority, being black, and being confronted by whiteness. That tells you something about what it means to be South African in the year 2014. You are still profoundly aware of your racial identity. You can't escape that, and you are ever present as a black person in the world. And walking around, that is something that is in your subconscious all the time. My second impression of the city was last night when we went for a walk. We tried to find some food because the hotel we're staying in had stopped serving food. And the first question I had, which I'd been wanting to ask a local, but I asked my fellow South Africans that instead, because I was embarrassed at how very South African the question is it safe to walk around? Is it actually safe? And I asked Johnny, who's researched and written about crime, what do you think crime levels are in this city? And he jokingly said, which I hope for your sake is true, that the last time a murder was recorded here would probably have been 10 years ago. And so you are fully aware of security issues, of the possibility of violence. That is still the South African reality. That you may be a crime victim, if not someone who will commit a crime. And that's something that's still with you ever present. Whether you've traveled the world, whether you can imagine a different way of being South African, that is part of your psyche. And I experienced that. I didn't tell them because I wanted them to have some stories that they wouldn't have witnessed or experienced with me. About 10 minutes ago, when we took a picture of a dog, and the dog owner wasn't very impressed and started whistling after us. And I thought to myself two things at that point, very quietly. The one was, oh wow, Norwegians can get angry as well. There's also the possibility of tension. And then the second thought was, I wonder if the guy is a skinhead. He looks a bit scary. Is he whistling after all three of us as foreigners? Is he whistling because he's a dog owner who is just sick and tired of people interfering with his dog? Or is his whistle mostly directed at me out of the three of us, as the non-white person in the group? I don't know which of those are true. Maybe all of those possibilities are false. Maybe all of them in different ways were present in the head of the dog owner whistling after us. But the point of it is that it gives you yet another little insight into what it means for me as a South African in the world, the kinds of issues that are constantly in your head as you carry yourself from one airport to another, from one city to another. And you can't run away from those realities. They just are ever present. And so in thinking about what the big comments are that I wanted to make about South Africa 20 years into democracy, there's always this difficulty when you travel abroad as a South African, that you want to be an ambassador for your country. Keep the sunny side up. Tell good stories. Come and give us your money. We are way cheaper than your city. You won't pay as much. You'll pay half the price for a burger as you do in this town. But at the same time, there are certain truths about South Africa that will be true, whether or not you are willing to share them in Norway or only at a room in a venue in Cape Town or in Johannesburg. And I would say that 20 years into our democracy, it is still a reality that although South Africa is politically free from apartheid and from our history, that socially and economically, we're not yet a country where freedom is fully enjoyed by a majority of the citizens, and we certainly aren't an equal society at all. We are a deeply unequal society, in some respects more unequal than 20 years ago in certain demographics, if you look at them in isolation. The gap between the haves and the have-nots amongst black South Africans is growing 20 years into democracy. And I would say that the single biggest negative thing about the fact of being South African in 2014 is inequality. Experts will fight with each other. What is the biggest enemy? Inequality, low economic growth, unemployment. And of course, the easy answer is all of them are important, because you want to wipe out every problem in a society. But I like sticking out my neck, putting my neck on the block. And if you can see how violent we are. Even our analogies are violent in South Africa. If you put a gun against my head and forced me to choose one of those social ills, if for some reason you can only deal with one of them, I would say it'd be inequality. Because inequality is the worst of all the bastards that we're trying to deal with between unemployment, crime, low economic growth, joblessness, inequality. And the reason for it, in my opinion, and we can debate this, is that inequality in particular correlates from a statistical point of view very well with the worst social challenges in South Africa. Whether you talk crime, whether you talk things that are more difficult to measure, like attitudes between white people and black people, discontent, distrust, it is inequality in particular that bothers me as a South African 20 years in, even more than the other things that are also important to deal with, like unemployment. And it's not really that mysterious to understand why. I live in Sandton in Johannesburg, and if you had to walk 5 minutes from my house the wrong direction from an economic point of view, you'll be in Alexandra, one of the big townships. And if you are a young black man living in Alex, and you see what's happening a couple of meters from your house, it breeds a level of dissatisfaction. You feel like a loser. You feel like one of the ones who didn't escape the poverty cycle in the township. It builds resentment. It makes you feel as a man, as if you're unable to provide for your family. And that very quickly translates into horrible ways of being a young black man in particular. And it's unsurprising in that unequal context that you should have not just crime, but in particular violent crime. It's also the reason, and I don't know why people find this a mystery, why there are other countries on the continent that may be economically poorer than South Africa, but in some respects, depends where you go obviously, but in some respects violent crime isn't always as much of a menace as it is in South Africa. So you say to yourself, why might that be? And the reason is, if you're looking at poverty, you're going to find the wrong answer. If you're looking at economic growth, you're going to find the wrong answer. You're going to be a little bit more successful, although we can play the numbers game, if you look at inequality in particular. Because it's that gap between the haves and the have-not that really is the basis of some of the worst social discontent in South Africa in 2014. And so I would say, if we don't deal with the inequality challenge in South Africa, that is our single biggest challenge to democratic stability in South Africa. Obviously, we need to grow the economy. We need to get people into jobs as quickly as possible. If we can do those things, it will all help. But I'm prepared to say the simple, even if it's accurate answer, is that we need to deal with all of those things in my country, that the one I would be happy to prioritize if I was a policy expert, which I'm not, would be inequality. And it links me to the second big issue I want to talk about around race and class in South Africa. Because if you ask, why is inequality still a problem 20 years into democracy? The answer is, for me, because if we've got to deal with inequality in South Africa, and ask, how do we make our country a more equal society? It's a conversation that will very quickly lead to other conversations that are very personal and very uncomfortable. It is far more comfortable intellectually and emotionally to ask the question, how do we create entrepreneurs? How do we improve the education system? How do we grow the economy from 2% to 7%? How do we create job opportunities? Those questions are not emotionally difficult questions. They may be intellectually difficult to solve. From a policy point of view, it might be difficult to come up with the perfect solution to get the economy to be bigger than it is currently. But it's not an emotionally difficult conversation. It's an emotionally safe conversation. When you focus on inequality, it is emotionally very difficult question, not just intellectually. And the reason for it is that it gets us into something that is an elephant in every South African conversation, which is race, and which is my personal responsibility if I have found myself on the lucky side of the inequality division through no choices of my own. And the connection between inequality and race-based privileges, unearned privileges, that is what makes inequality difficult. And that's why people will say, we have a triple challenge in South Africa: inequality, unemployment, and poverty. But if you listen carefully to the next 30 minutes of that conversation, it is actually only ever really about poverty or unemployment. It is never really about the third in that triple challenge, inequality. And there's a couple of reasons there, and I'll just state them and I'll pause so we can have a bit of a conversation. The first reason is that if you want to deal with inequality, you have to bring in your own personal life into it. And here in particular, it's a challenge for white South Africans. Most wealth in South Africa is still distributed and concentrated along racial lines. So if I profess as a white South African that I care deeply about dealing with inequality, if I really mean that, then it will require me to ask questions about, where does my education come from? Where does my great big house in the suburbs come from? Why have more people who look like me been able to travel the world, go to great educational institutions, than people who don't look like me in terms of skin color? You have to examine the basis of your own success as a middle-class white South African. And that's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable because it's deeply personal, and there's the possibility that some of the answers will require you to give up certain beliefs that you have had about yourself and your family that are very nice beliefs to have. And those beliefs, the most central belief that you might have had before you thought about inequality as a white South African, is that your success, your education, your wealth is explained mostly by two things: your natural talent and sheer hard work. But if you think about it, the only way you can explain why so many of your fellow South Africans who are black are worse off, if you really believe that your successes are attributed to talent plus hard work, would be if most black people either lack talent or just bloody lazy. Then you've got to choose. Was Mother Nature a bastard who did not distribute talents randomly in the human population? No, we all know that from biology. There's only one other possibility to sustain your amazing belief about you and your family, and that would be if hard work is a good explanation. And that's just bullshit. The real answer is that in different mixes, it's a combination of talent, hard work, and the big issue in South African race conversation, unearned privileges. People just can't make sense of the idea of privileges that you have that have made your life easy in the world that have been unearned. And it's a universal thing. It's not South Africa specific. My favorite analogy is in gender. I mean, let's take one of my favorite activities. I'm a professional public speaker and a competitive debater. I've won a world title, a national title for competitive debate. If I had a soft voice, if I spoke like this, if I was a little bit small, if I still was very effeminate, that was my comportment as a kid. I was the biggest queen in Grahamstown. You can remember me as a child. We grew up together. You remember, don't you? I was. I used to get teased in primary school. I used to run away so the boys can't find me and shove me and tease me for being just incredibly effeminate as a kid. But I was emotionally abused for being effeminate. And my voice, when I was 13, the coolest thing that happened to me as a child is when my voice started breaking and suddenly I had a slightly deeper voice. It has made all the difference in my career as a public speaker and a competitive debater. Why? Because the world thinks if you shout and you speak like this, and you have amazing body language and you're confident, then you must be a really compelling speaker. If you have a soft voice, if you're slightly shy, if you look down, then you obviously don't have confidence. You don't really believe what you are saying. The lesson of that, and the same can be found in politics the world over, in corporate structures the world over, is that we live in a world that, without thinking, privileges certain masculine ways of being. So if you want your sister to do well in a law firm in New York, she has to become a type A personality, high heels, walk like a man, and really carry herself. And that's because we accept certain masculine standards as standards of excellence without asking ourselves, why the hell should we do that? It's an accident of history that masculine traits get privileged as indicators of excellence in the way you speak, what counts as good leadership. In a similar way, in South Africa, as a deliberate social and political project, being white was a marker of excellence. And that has infiltrated every aspect of South African life. And it has resulted in, if you are born into a family as a white person, you're born into a family where you are privileged just because you are white, even if you haven't chosen that way of being. I'll just say one thing and then I'll stop there. I mean, firstly, whiteness was such an advantage in South Africa that as black people we tried to mimic it. If you went to our schools in Grahamstown, which were colored schools only for biracial kids, if you have nice long flowing hair like a white person, even if you're the dumbest kid in the class, you're going to be the head prefect. You're going to be head girl or head boy when you are in the highest class that you can be in that primary school. Why? Because if you are light-skinned and you have beautiful flowing hair, you are seen as gorgeous, as great, as a symbol of excellence. The kid who's really good academically, but God forbid, happen to be very dark-skinned, will in that year not be the child that gets appointed the head prefect, even if there's a tradition of looking for the cleverest kid to be the head prefect. So we've internalized that nonsense as black South Africans. White people have internalized it. And so we are at a place 20 years into democracy where race still defines our primary experiences. There are some interesting class differences that are now coming in. You have a middle class that is black. But I find that what a lot of people do, experts and ordinary South Africans, is that we're so scared that talking about race is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to make the entire book festival a little bit awkward, that we now pretend that every South African problem is a class problem or a cultural problem. And I think that's a lie. It's a lie for two simple reasons. And that will really be the end of my opening remarks. The one is, in no society are you either a black person or a rich person, a woman or a poor person. You are always all of the different categories at the same time. It's a false habit in universities to try and cut up the world into one of those categories. You are always many different categories at the same time. So you can't get rid of the fact that I'm from Grahamstown, from the Eastern Cape, came from a working class family, that I'm homosexual, that I am, in South African terms, colored, I call myself black. You can't run away from any of those things. So there's no use trying to choose between class or race. All of that matters. But it means that race hasn't gone out the window. We just appreciate that it intersects with other categories. And that's very important. The other problem with us not dealing with our challenges in South Africa is that people don't want to open up the conversation. What is unearned privilege? And what will I do about my unearned privilege? Many people think that's an illegitimate question to ask. And for as long as they think that, I think that while South Africa has been called a miracle country for the transition, the next wave of the transition, which is economic and social, is still going to be some way off until we are comfortable asking the right questions. Thanks. Okay, there's a lot more I can say. When we take a break, I'm happy to talk to anyone over the course of the next 2 days. Also, in the next conversation, we'll have more chance with Teresa and with Johnny to continue that in the second session. But at this stage, I want to give you the opportunity to say whatever you want, to ask whatever questions you want. And I know you have different degrees of interest and knowledge about the country, so I'm happy to answer at any level. Okay, there's no such thing as a silly question. You can ask me anything under the sun. Yes.
Since this is a literary festival, first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting introduction. But since this is a literary festival, can you say a few words about the role of literature in South Africa today? Does it have any impact on things, and also elaborating a little bit about non-fiction academic books contra fiction literature?
Brilliant question. Literature can play an amazing role in South African life, and it doesn't yet play the role that it can. And there are many reasons for it. I don't know all the facts, so this is anecdotal. We don't have enough South Africans buying books, and we don't have enough South Africans reading books. We have, I don't know what, over 50 million South Africans, our population. If you have about 4,000 copies of your book sold, you're regarded as a bestseller. So I can call myself a best-selling author because I sold 10,000 copies of my first book, about 5,000 of my second book. So levels of reading in South Africa really are still horribly low. It's not just tragic because we all love books and literature. It's also tragic because it connects to the issues that I spoke about. If South Africans are going to break down cultural apartheid, geographic apartheid, living apart, rather than living inside each other's worlds, one of the easiest ways to do that is through literature. We were talking yesterday about a fellow South African writer, Jacob Dlamini. He wrote a book, his first book was called Native Nostalgia, about black life in the townships during apartheid. What was great about that book, especially for white South Africans, but for all middle-class South Africans, is that you get transported into another world that is not your own, and you learn how the other lives in a way that you can't know through academic text, which isn't as textured as a work of fiction or even a memoir. And I always bemoan the underuse of literature as a device through which South Africans can get to know each other, but also through which they can raise some of the issues that I'm talking about. I love nonfiction, that's what I write. But if I had to go back to university as a lecturer, which I don't do full-time at the moment, one thing I would do differently as a philosophy lecturer is use, especially fiction, much more as a device to raise political, social, and moral questions. Because I find that talking about inequality is already very difficult. And if you can use literary devices, all artistic devices, film for that matter is too, but books in particular in the context of this festival, I think it makes it so much easier to use a James Coetzee book like this, Grace, and get into the discomfort of South African social life through the characters. And there's a lack of imagination on the part of not just teachers in high school, but also university lecturers in the liberal arts faculties, who often stick very slavishly to textbooks, to data, to graphs, and they don't use fiction in particular in a subject like sociology or in philosophy as a means to raise these questions so that people get into the emotional truth but also still have their focus on some of the difficult principal questions. So we need to do that much, much, much more. One genre, to answer your second question, that is, I think, reasonably healthy in South Africa, although I'd have to think about it some more, is that we're beginning to see a lot of South African writers, or at least some, writing books about academic questions in a way that is accessible. My entire mission as a writer is really to write about academic philosophy in a way that is accessible to someone who hasn't studied the subject, by using personal stories and then taking the personal stories as a basis for asking principled questions. Now, any of my friends who study philosophy or my colleagues who are in philosophy, if they read my book, my first book in particular, they will know that it's actually crib notes from philosophy seminars. But that doesn't bother me. That's not even a diss, that's not a critique. I'm happy that that book, because of its style choices, could be taken out at one of our libraries at the university. They bought something like 200 copies, and within the first 4 months, about 2,000 students had taken the books out on loan. If more people are reading and engaging difficult questions because we're telling stories, I think that's great. I think too many academics in South Africa who do really good social science research about the issues that I've raised don't know how to write it in a way that is accessible to a wider audience.
The life as black in South Africa is for the international society always painted by white writers from South Africa. Garcia, Andrew Brady, Nadine Gordimer. The white writers who are telling us how it is to be black in South Africa. Is that a problem for you?
It's not a problem for me, but that's because I've got a very liberal concept of what the role of the writer is. I think anyone is allowed to write, and anyone must write selfishly about how they see South Africa. I was deeply dismayed when there were some people in the African National Congress who were very upset at a book like Disgrace by James Coetzee being taught at high school, because they thought that the black characters in the book are pathetic, are morally quite warped, and I was uncomfortable with that protest. I love James Coetzee. I think he's the best writer we have in the country. And the fact that he's white doesn't bother me. I think anyone is allowed to have a voice, anyone can write. If there are books that you'd like to see, write them yourself. So I don't have a problem with that at all. I also think that the wrong way for white South Africans to respond to privilege is to shut up, to retreat, to not write. The correct answer to the question you didn't ask is that more black voices need to make themselves heard, and institutions should show leadership in getting those voices heard. And there are great black writers in fiction, in particular, currently in South Africa. I think we need to talk about them more than we do, but I don't think a condition for speaking about their work is that James Coetzee shouldn't be taught in high school. She says you mustn't ask.
Okay, very short. Then we'll have a short break and we'll continue, and you can continue.
Yeah, okay, short one. I'll give a short answer for now, yeah?
You were talking about that having and not having is a very important aspect of separating African society today. And I just wonder, does there exist such a thing as a poor white class in South Africa?
Yes, it's a rare species, but it does exist. That's the short answer. I said I'd keep it short. If you want the long version, come back after the break.